You know the Slender Man meme? It reminds me of the story my great-grandmother used to tell me about a monster named Long Jack. I know Slender Man is just a meme started on something awful and it spawned all sorts of stories and pictures, pranks, all that stuff. But certain images and aspects reminded me of that old ghost story, so here it is. I guess I should start by saying that I didn't actually hear the story firsthand. When I was little, my brother and I lived at my grandmother's house for a while during our parents' divorce. My grandmother lived just down the road in a cottage, and the power would reliably go out during big winter storms, and great-grandmother, who we called Tiny Grandma because she was kind of Yoda-ish, would come over and we would all sit in front of the fire and wait it out. The old folks would tell stories and read books, and since I was only 4 or 5 at the time, Tiny Grandma would only tell the story of Long Jack after I fell asleep, and then my older brother would tell it to me later. Now, Tiny Grandma and the rest of us lived in the Pacific Northwest, way out in the boonies actually. She herself was an infant when her parents brought her out west. They were homesteaders. There's an old photo of her as a child, standing in front of a one-room log schoolhouse. There were dozens of huge trees behind her, lots of dark shadows. It's still very gloomy in the winter months here, even though the trees are much thinner these days. Now, Long Jack, whatever he was originally a person. In that time in history, families lived by themselves in the woods, miles and hours travel from each other. But there were also a lot of people coming and going. Other homesteaders, people looking for logging jobs, prospectors on their way to the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush or Klondike Gold Rush, whatever you want to call it. There weren't hotels, except those in big cities, so when you slept, it was either in your own camp or some courteous homesteader would let you sleep in their house or barn. I guess violent crime wasn't as much of a threat in those days, or maybe people just were more naive or something. But the guy who became Long Jack was a murderer. There had been a long string of murders in the region. Sometimes whole families would be slaughtered, and the blame was usually cast on Native Americans as there were still some isolated wars between Native Americans at that time. But it didn't exactly look like that. More like the victims were willingly inviting someone in only to be murdered by that someone in their sleep. Obviously, detective work wasn't big back then, and in any case it would sometimes take weeks or even months before anyone found the bodies, and by then the killer would be long gone. Now, I don't know if Long Jack, whatever his real name was, actually murdered all of these people, but he did actually kill at least one of the families. He was caught, quite literally, red-handed, near the town of Bellingham, near where my family's from. They used to lynch people in those days. Usually it was blacks, but in the Pacific Northwest, where there wasn't a lot of black people, it was more often Chinese or Eastern European men. But occasionally, they lynched white men, even though they had a proper court system at the time. Still, it was risky to do, and the vigilantes did risk some blowback, so the local sheriff, John Larrabee, took the murderer out of his cell at night and took him south of town with a few others to some cliffs, and they built a primitive gallows with an extra long rope, with the intent to hang him off the cliffs up high. Well, the hangman that day was a local eccentric by the name of Dan Harris. They picked him because he was a retired soldier and knew everything there was to know about ropes and knots. He agreed to do the job because, as a soldier, he had specifically been a whaler and had a morbid fascination with flesh and how to disassemble and render it. Had the posse of vigilantes known that, they probably wouldn't have asked him to do the job. Dan Harris didn't just cut the noose around the condemned man's neck. He put small nooses made of cord around each of his fingers, and at the end of each of the cords was a heavy lead weight. Around each wrist was a length of rope with a heavy stone attached to it, and around each ankle was another length of rope attached to even heavier stones. The posse watched Harris do all of this, but they did not know what he was doing, and even Larrabee didn't have the foresight to object. It came time to hang the man, and someone in the posse finally pushed, and the man fell quickly to his doom. The men expected to hear the sharp crack of a breaking neck, but all they heard was the sound of counting in Harris's low voice. He had tied the noose to strangle, not break. 1, 2, 3, 4. They heard a loud crack, almost like a gunshot. 7, 8, 9, 10. But then they heard another. It wasn't the man's neck, but his legs dislocating from his hip. 14, 15, 16. They heard more pops and cracks, his shoulders dislocating, his elbows, his ankles. 21, 22, 23. Then his fingers dislocated at each knuckle, each with a resounding crack. Choking grunts could still be heard from the man. He was still alive and conscious through all of this. 36, 37, 38. Harris's voice became louder, and the rest of the men were enraptured by the spectacle. When he came to 43, it was the loudest crack of all. The makeshift goblet broke, and the murderer, along with all the weights and rope, went tumbling from the cliff face, his neck and limbs twisting and flailing at impossible angles. In the darkness, they could barely make out his corpse at the bottom. It was a horrifying sight. His limbs had been stretched to awful lengths, all intertwined with the ropes and each other. It was too dark to retrieve the body, and by the next day, animals had gotten to it and carried it away. This is where my great-grandmother comes in. They used to tell her that the ghost of Long Jack haunted those woods, abducting defenseless people if they traveled through them. They said he would count as he stepped up behind you.
1, 2, 3, 4.
She heard him once, as she walked a long distance home from school one fall afternoon.
14, 15, 16.
According to the story, you couldn't look back or he'd get you. You could only run as fast as you could, and run she did.
21, 22, 23.
The counting continued. It was like he was whispering, but somehow still getting louder, and it seemed like he was right behind her.
27, 28.
She could hear his footfalls behind her. His stride was much longer than hers, longer than any adult's. She could tell by the rhythm of his footfalls that his legs were impossibly long, likely bending and twisting in some unnatural position. She got to the door of their cabin.
37, 38.
And then slammed the door shut. Silence. She knew from the stories she had been told that if he had gotten to 43, she would have been killed. There were other kids who had gotten lost in the woods in those days, never to be found. So that's the story of Long Jack, as my great-grandmother told it, or as my brother told it, I should say. I don't believe in ghosts myself, but I always liked this story. I haven't found any mention of such a murderer in the local archives, but I didn't really expect to. Some of the other names mentioned in the story, though, actually did check out.